Welcome to Wheelock's Latin chapter 25. In this week's lesson, we're going to be looking at infinitives and a very specific usage of the infinitive, the indirect statement. Let's start off by looking at the specific kinds of infinitives that we find in Latin. Now, we've already learned two of our infinitival forms. We have learned the present active and the present passive infinitives. If you'll remember, the present active infinitive is simply the second principal part of any verb. The telltale sign is that RE suffix. And of course, the connecting vowel that determines conjugation is prominent here. The long A with the macron there. For first conjugation, laudari, the long E for second conjugation, so moneri. The third conjugation, the short E, so ageri. Fourth conjugation, long I, audiri. And lastly, the third IO, caperi, the short E. For the present passive infinitive, of course, we learned that that final E in that RE suffix changes to a long I. This is true for all of the conjugations. So you end up with laudari, moneri. It should be ageri, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Audiri in the fourth conjugation, and caperi. Again, that's what it should be, but if you remember that in the present passive, the third conjugation drops that ER. So A-G-E-R-I, that ER goes away. And for caperi, the third IO, that ER goes away. So you end up with agi and capi. So you just have to remember that third and third IO function, or I should say act just a bit differently in the present passive infinitive. So those are the forms that we've already learned. The new forms that we will be learning in this chapter are the perfect active, the perfect passive, the future active, and the future passive infinitive. Now, as you can see here on the chart, the perfect active infinitive simply takes the third principal part, there we go, third principal part from each of the verbs and adds the suffix isse. So for lado, ladari, ladawi, you drop that I ending that you have, ladawi. That leaves you the stem, ladav, L-A-U-D-A-V, and you add simply isse. So you end up ladawisi. So monoo, moneri, monui becomes monuisi. Ago, ageri, egi becomes agisi. And the fourth conjugation, adeo, adiri, adiwi, you get adiwisi. And finally, kapao, kaperi, kepi, you get kepisi. So those are your perfect active infinitives. For the perfect passive infinitives, you take the fourth principal part, or also the same form as the perfect passive participle, and you simply add an esse. This is not a suffix. This is a separate word. So if you recognize esse, so that's simply the second principal part of the irregular verb sum, esse, fui, futurum. This is the to be verb. And so we're going to add this infinitive, the second principal part, esse, to the fourth principal part, or the perfect passive participle. So you end up with laudatus aum esse, monatus aum esse, actus aum esse, auditus aum esse, and captus aum esse. Note again, those are two separate words. They're not joined together. We'll talk about translation in just a minute. The future active infinitive does just about the same thing, except we're going to take the future active participle, which, if you notice, is just the perfect passive participle, or fourth principal part, plus the infix in there. So you end up with laudaturus aum. And again, we're going to add the esse to it. So laudaturus aum esse, monaturus aum esse, acturus aum esse, auditorus aum esse, and capturus aum esse. Again, note that these are two words together, laudaturus esse, monaturus esse, etc. And then finally, a form that is rarely used, and really Wheelock's doesn't really, I don't think there's ever any usage of this in the Wheelock's textbook, but the future passive infinitive, which makes use of the supine, and you have not learned the supine yet. We've not covered that. That won't be covered in Wheelock's until chapter 38, I believe. So this is the supine, which basically is based off of the perfect passive participle neuter form. And that's really all I'll say right now. We'll cover that in a few weeks when we get to chapter 38. But you take that form, here it's laudatum, and you add iri, I-R-I. Laudatum iri, monitum iri, actum iri, auditum iri, and captum iri. I wouldn't worry too much about this particular form because you just simply won't see it very often. All right, so nota bene, as I already mentioned, these three forms are two words. This is different from the perfect active form where isse is added to the third principal part. So laudavisi is all one word, but these others are two separate words. So just by way of a summary here are the forms, the second principal part with the ARE or ERE, etc. That's the present active. The present passive, you've got the same form, but the final E shifts to a long I, adari, eri, etc. Perfect active infinitive is the perfect stem plus isse. The perfect passive infinitive is the passive perfect participle plus esse. Future active is the future active participle plus esse. And then finally, the future passive is the supine in basically the neuter form plus iri. Again, we won't worry about that future passive too much. All right, what about translation? How do we translate the infinitive? Well, as you know, the present active is simply just to, whatever the verb is. Here, laudare, to praise. Laudare, to be praised. The perfect active, laudavisi, is to have praised. Perfect passive, laudatus aum esse, is to have been praised. And the future active, laudatorus aum esse, is to be about to praise. And then finally, the future passive, laudatum iri, is to be about to be praised. Now, these are conventional translations that aren't translated frequently this way at all, because the usage of these infinitives are in different constructs, which will require a different kind of translation. So don't get too excited about having to worry about these very awkward, not very fluid English translations. We'll learn more about how to translate them as we move forward here. Now let's look at different uses of the infinitive. We have already learned about the use of the infinitive as the subject of a sentence. It's used as a noun here as a subject. An example of the famous example, errare est humanum, to err is human. Here, errare, to err, is used as a nominative subject of the linking verb est, so subject of a sentence. All right, we've also learned about the complementary use of the infinitive. This is when the infinitive is needed to complete the idea of the verb, most frequently used with verbs like possum, adere, like to dare, debeo, deberi, to owe or to ought. These require the complementary infinitive. So here we have descerere nunc possunt, they are now, possunt nunc, they are now able, possunt, to leave, descerere, they are able to leave. So to just simply say they are now able isn't fully a completed thought. So you have to add the to leave, the infinitive descerere. So that is one usage we've already looked at. A third usage, which we have talked about, is the usage of the infinitive as a direct object of a subject that is in the accusative. Here's an example. Visit, he ordered eos them, venere, to come. Here, venere is being used as the direct object of eos, which is itself the direct object of the verb visit. But here it is also the subject in the accusative of the infinitive venere. He ordered them. What did he order them? To come. And then finally, this is the focus of the rest of this lesson, the usage of the infinitive in the indirect statement, which is a very common usage. Let's take a look at the next slide and see what this looks like. Indirect statements. Well, what is an indirect statement? Well, we're going to compare this to a direct statement so that we can understand a little bit better. The indirect statement is simply statements that are made indirectly. And direct statements are statements that are made directly. So, duh. I mean, that just makes sense. What are some examples just so that we can understand what this looks like? Here we go. So a direct statement is a statement made from someone. Here we have the teacher said, Julia is a good student. Here the teacher is specifically, directly stating something about Julia, and it is directly quoted. The teacher said, Julia is a good student. Here in Latin, that would be Magister inquiit Julia es bona discipula. The teacher said, Julia is a good student. So this is a direct statement, but our lesson in this chapter is about indirect statements. And again, this is a statement made indirectly from someone. So here we have, in English, the teacher says that Julia is a good student. In English, we would often have the word that introducing the indirect statement. What is the teacher saying? She's saying that Julia is a good student. Notice this is not a quote. This is a way of indirectly saying something that somebody has already said. And as such, notice it does not have quotation marks. This is just reporting something that a third party has said. The teacher says that Julia is a good student. In Latin, this is what it looks like. Magister dicit Magister dicit Juliam esse bona discipula. The teacher, Magister, dicit says, Julia esse, to be a good student, bona discipula. Now we're going to explain that construction here in just a second here. Let's take a look at this. Here's the elements of an indirect statement. Number one, we're going to have a head verb or a verb of perception. This is a verb of mental activity, speech, etc. You're also going to have a subject of this dependent clause in the accusative case. And then thirdly, you will have an infinitive in the dependent clause. As you translate it in an indirect statement, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, we're going to add the English word that into our translation after the main verb and before the accusative subject of the dependent clause. So Julia says that. The teacher says that Julia is a good student. And then finally, translate the infinitive as an indicative verb, so not as an infinitive. And then the tense of the verb in this dependent clause is going to be relative to the tense of the main verb. We learned all about that relative nature of participles to the main verbs. This is going to hold true for infinitives. The tense of that infinitive is relative to the tense of the main verb. So if you remember our chart here, this works true for infinitives as it did in the participles. The present tense infinitive will be action happening at the same time as the action of the main verb. A perfect tense infinitive will be taking place before the action of the main verb. And then a future tense infinitive will be happening after the time of the main verb. So let's take a look at this in practical expression here. Now, we're going to take a present tense main verb, and we're going to give three different possibilities here, three different examples, I should say, of the subordinate infinitive in the subordinate clause. We're going to have a present infinitive. The next example will be the exact same sentence, but with a perfect infinitive, and then we'll have a future infinitive. So let's take it the first one here. Dicunt irare eam. So irare is a present active infinitive. So it simply translates, they say, dicunt. Notice dicunt is in the present tense, main verb. In all three of these examples, this main verb is going to be the present tense. Dicunt, they say, he, but we have to add the word that. They say that, he, irare. So we're going to translate this as indicative, not as to be, to help. We're going to translate this as helping, indicative. And remember, present infinitive is relative to the time of the main verb. So this is a present infinitive. It's happening at the same time as the main verb, which is in present tense. So they say that he is helping her. All right, what does that look like if the infinitive becomes a perfect infinitive? Dicunt wissi eam. Here we have the perfect active infinitive, wissi. So they say that he, they say that he was helping, or that he helped, because this is happening, it's perfect tense infinitive, so it's got to be happening before the main verb, which is in the present, so it's got to be in the past. They say that he helped or was helping her. And then finally, the future infinitive, dicunt itorum esse, utorum esse eam. So itorum esse is our future active infinitive. They say that he will help her. So here the future active infinitive is relative to the main verb. It's happening in the future. It has to be happening after our present time. So they say that he will help her. Now, let's take this exact same sentence, and what we're going to do now is change the tense of the main verb to a perfect. There we go. Yeah, a perfect main verb. But again, we're going to use three examples, a present perfect and future infinitive. So here we have dixerunt errari eam. Now this is the exact same as the earlier example in letter A, but we've changed the main verb to a perfect tense. So dixerunt, they said that that he, errari, present tense. So it's happening at the same time as the main verb. The main verb is in the past. It's perfect tense. So it has to also be in the past. They say that he was helping her. Same time as the main verb, past tense. But what if the infinitive is in the perfect tense? So here we have awisse. Dixerunt awisse eam. They said that he had helped her. So again, the infinitive is in the it's relative to the main verb, so it's happening before the main verb. The main verb is in the past, so this is past if you remember from our participial discussions. So you translate it as it's pluperfect. They said that he had helped her. And then finally, an example with the future active infinitive. Iotorum esse. Dixerunt iotorum esse eam. They said that he would help her. Now here you can translate that future as would. There's a sense of possibility here, not definitiveness. It's in the future. All right. They said that he would help her. Let's look finally at a main verb that is in the future tense with, again, the same three present perfect and future infinitives. Here we have dicint. This is the future tense main verb of dico. Dicint errari eam. They will say that he is helping her. So errari is the present tense. It's happening at the same time as the main verb. So is helping. They say that he is helping her. Perfect infinitive. Dicint awisse eam. They will say that he helped her or was helping her. And then finally, the future infinitive iotorum esse. Dicint iotorum esse eam. They will say that he will help her. So this is future. It's happening after the verb, which is already in the future. So it's got to happen. It's like the future. This is sort of like the future perfect. They will say that he will help her. So this is how we translate indirect statements. They're pretty easy to see. Again, look for a verb of mental assent, what we call a head verb. Look for a subject, a word that is going to function as a subject, but it's in the accusative, and look for an infinitive. And if you have all three of those components, then you've got an indirect statement. And don't forget to add the word that in your translation. All right, don't forget to look at your vocabulary. We'll have a quiz at the end of the day.